Hi, welcome to the second part of this tutorial series about Unreal Next Gen graphics. My name is Tobias Tabasco, and today will be all about ray tracing. I've already set up a small scene so that we can start working right away. Before we do that though, if you have not watched the first part of our scene setup, I just quickly want to show you how to enable the ray tracing. And that would be if you go into the project settings under Edit Project Settings and then Rendering. There is a ray tracing section pretty much all the way down there. And you can just tick this box. It will ask you to enable the support compute skin cache, and you can just hit yes, and then the ray tracing should be enabled. One last thing that you want to double check before you restart though is that under platform Windows, your default RHI is set to DirectX 12. Usually it's set to default, so it needs to be set to DirectX 12, and here of course the checkbox also needs to be set to true. Okay, and then just restart and the ray tracing should already be enabled. In the first part we created our little widget here at the top left, which allows us to enable and disable the ray tracing super easily. As you can see, I've pimped this a little bit and added some other stuff to it. For example, the SSGI I can toggle on and off now as well as the distance field ambient occlusion. I can quickly show you how to do that as well. So if we take a look at our widget, it's basically exactly the same as it was before. We created this checkbox in the horizontal box. I just wrapped it with a border, so you can just right click, wrap with, and then border to get this blue border around the widget, just so that I can distinguish it a bit better. And then inside of the border you will have to go to the brush settings and set the draw as. It should be set to image by default. You should now set it to border, and then all the margins need to be around 0.75, and then it should be visible as soon as you compile the widget with a border. I obviously tinted it as well and gave it a padding of 5, so that we have a bit more space between this and the horizontal box here. And then I just duplicated it, the entire thing with the border, and added a spacer in between. A spacer is just an empty space, and I gave it a width of 10 in here in the spacer. And then yeah, I duplicated this and duplicated this, and renamed obviously the text. And I also created events for both of these checkboxes here under the on checkbox state changed. And instead of branching on this boolean here, I created something that is called a select node. So if you drag out here and you type select, you can select this one here with the yellow one, which is the universal select, and then as soon as you drag the boolean in there, you can set it to false and true in just one node rather than branching. I really like doing it like this, as it's a bit neater than using a branch. Yeah, and then the commands, we already had this one last time entered. This is for the ray tracing for like our ray tracing, force all ray tracing effects to 1 or to -1 for being enabled. Well, it's enabled and using the settings from our post-process volume. That's important. And then for the SSGI, the same command to enable and disable is RSSGI. So SSGI stands for Screenspace Global Illumination, which we enabled in the project settings as well. I can quickly show you that again. That was also under rendering, and then if you type Screenspace Global Illumination, then we had enabled it here. And yeah, so this is the one for Screenspace Ambient Global Illumination, enable 1 or 0, and for the distance field ambient occlusion, it's our distance field AO, 0 or 1. And these 3 commands are just quite handy to show you what's going on exactly and to debug a bit better what exactly we are doing with the ray tracing. If you have never had any experience with ray tracing at all, here's a small infographic by NVIDIA. And all of these ray tracing types exist in Unreal as well. So there's ambient occlusion, RayTraced Shadows, the RayTraced reflections, of course, and even the RayTraced global illumination. And as you can see in this infographic, all of these methods work a tiny bit differently. For example, on the ambient occlusion, it shoots one ray, and then from that ray, smaller rays, but multiple. For example, on the reflections, it just shoots one and then bounces off once, most likely. And on the global illumination, it shoots in all directions and bounces off a lot more. And you can already see here that is also the reason why some methods of ray tracing are more expensive than others. So, for example, the reflections and the shadows are relatively cheap compared to the ambient occlusion and the global illumination. And let's take a look at all of these inside of Unreal. Sorry about that. So all these settings are located in the post-process volume. By the way, this is the scene that we left off with. Basically, I just added some more props. I just duplicated a sphere and some more cubes just so that we can see a bit better what is going on with all the ray tracing. And again, if we go into the post-process volume, we can find all the ray tracing settings here under rendering features. So there is ray tracing ambient occlusion, ray tracing global illumination, the ray traced reflections, and even ray traced translucency, which is why I've already created a glass material. I will show you that later on, just so that we can take a look at the ray traced translucency as well. Let's get started. We can just start from the top with the ray traced ambient occlusion, and we're just going to toggle one feature on at a time, or just go through it, all the settings and so on. I've already created some presets basically for myself, and I can just show those to you, and I think they work quite well. I do not have an RTX card, by the way, so for me all of this is quite slow, but I tested this on another machine with an RTX card, and there it runs relatively okay. I think with ray tracing in general, it's always a back and forth between quality and performance, of course, and some of the features are also not really going hand in hand. So you might just juggle all these features a little bit to the preferred look that you want to have in your game or in your scene. So ray traced ambient occlusion, right now it's set to on, and I've toggled with this checkbox ray tracing. I've toggled it on. You can also see quite a lot of change happening actually when I turn it off and on. And one thing that I noticed as well is that if we would turn the ray traced ambient occlusion off, we will actually, if we go onto the normal ambient occlusion here and we change some settings in here, we would usually not see anything, and that is due to the SSGI. So if we turn the SSGI on, which it should have been by default, by the way, and we change some settings in here in the normal ambient occlusion, the non-ray traced one, you will not see any change. And that is due to the fact that the SSGI does not work with the Screenspace ambient occlusion together. So you have to decide whether you want the SSGI or the Screenspace ambient occlusion. I personally think this is quite a bad... I'm not sure if it's a bug or if it's just because it was a handy implementation, I'm not sure. And some people also say that the Screenspace global illumination should actually handle the shadows in here as well, but I don't really agree with that. I think it would be really nice to have both of those together, because I think well, this is obviously way too strong, but I think the ambient occlusion, of course, adds something in some areas, and the Screenspace GI, you really feel that the lack of all of these shadows in the corner. Yeah, and one thing to counter this, of course, I'm just going to go through both of these settings, by the way, like the Screenspace one and the ray tracing one, because I think it's important that you can toggle each feature on and off, and it should obviously look good for both, right? So one thing to counter this lack of the ambient occlusion, if you decide to go with the Screenspace global illumination, which I think is a good idea, because the Screenspace global illumination adds a lot in some areas. If you're unfamiliar with global illumination, what it does is the light bounces off of surfaces and picks up the light from the surface. You can see this clearly here in the cube. If I turn off the SSGI, you can see there is no blue tint at all in there. And if I turn it on, it's a nice blue tint from that cube, which is, of course, how natural light behaves, right? So this is the behavior that we want. So I think SSGI actually adds a lot. But, well, this thing with the ambient occlusion is a bit of a problem. But if we turn on the distance field ambient occlusion, then we can see that we still do get some darker spots now. And the entire thing just looks a tiny bit more natural, yeah, which is great. So we can kind of compensate for these errors that we are getting from the SSGI by using the distance field ambient occlusion. The distance field ambient occlusion, by the way, is not in these settings here for whatever reason. They decided to put that in the skylight. So if you go in the skylight under distance field ambient occlusion, you can find all the settings here. Your default settings might differ a little bit. I've changed this so that I tweaked the distance a bit, enhanced the contrast and the exponent, and also this minimum occlusion slider in here that is a bit counterintuitive. That is actually how much opacity the distance field ambient occlusion has. The distance field ambient occlusion is quite inaccurate if you compare it to the normal one. So if I toggle off the SSGI, you can see the normal one only. The normal one only gives you this really nice details in here, like this in these smaller corners. You get really nice details from that one, whereas the distance field one gives you these larger details, and it doesn't really work on these very small corners. But I think a combination of these two methods actually looks really nice and quite close to the RayTraced version. So if we again go to the RayTraced settings, oh my god, so many settings. Here, RayTraced ambient occlusion, and we turn the ambient occlusion on. We can see that the difference is not massive. Of course, the RayTraced one looks beautiful. Like it really has a nice gradient from quite dark in this corner here to fading out, and we have this dark areas right where the two edges come together. But if we cannot afford the ray traced ones, this combination of both of them is actually quite nice. But as I said, you will have to decide whether or not you want the normal ambient occlusion to work here, or if you want the SSGI. It's really a big difference enabling the SSGI, but I think it still is something that we want, because it gives you just more fidelity in the lighting itself. Like here on the right, you can also clearly see the right light of the cube, and that just looks beautiful. Yeah, that's really what we want. One more thing to this ambient occlusion, the distance field one, I've set this here to multiply, so it will actually combine the two if the SSGI is disabled, and I think that is the nicest behavior. That's why they did that. Okay, so my preferred setting for the ambient occlusion would of course be the ambient occlusion of the RayTraced one, but if you cannot afford that, I think this is a good fallback solution. And then if we enable it, it looks really good together as well with the SSGI, because maybe we cannot afford the RayTraced global illumination, but the SSGI we can afford. I'm also going to show you how much the cost of each of these individual ones is actually later on in the GPU profiler. If we take a look at the settings that we get here, of course, we will get the samples per pixel. That is basically what denoises this entire scene. So if we take a look at the AO, it's quite a bit noisy in some areas. And if we would put the sample rate higher to something like 2 or 4 even, then all of these artifacts will be smoothed out, and it just looks really smooth. This is of course coming with a price, right? So I usually leave this on 1 for the ambient occlusion, because I think the ambient occlusion is usually in dark parts anyway, and you will most likely not have these pristine cubes in your scene. You will have some rocks or some natural, a bit noisier shapes than that, and maybe some normal maps and so on going on. So you will probably not see this noisiness in the ambient occlusion as much. On the reflections, for example, I think this is more important to find the right settings there. Okay, so now that we have discussed the ambient occlusion, I think the radius is fine. We can just leave that as is. I think it looks quite decent. It gives us enough detail in the larger areas and in the smaller areas. So that is the ray-traced ambient occlusion. I'm gonna probably leave that on for now, just so that we have all the ray tracing settings on at the same time. And then let's go to the RayTraced Global Illumination. That is for sure the most expensive one of all the ray tracing solutions that we have implemented here. So this will really drop my performance. I'm already here at only 20 FPS, so this will go down even further now if I set this to brute force, which is basically the hardcore method. I think the default values are set a bit differently to 1 bounce and 4 samples, but I actually prefer a 2 sample and 2 bounces method. I think the second bounce looks quite good. Maybe we can see that here. If we set it to only 1 bounce, in this, especially in the darker areas, we will not get as much fidelity in these bounces here, color-wise. And I think a second bounce, as you can clearly see, just brightens up this shadow with more light, of course, because more bounces means more color information is being transferred as well, right? Here you can actually not see a stark difference. It's more in these really dark areas where you will be able to spot the difference between these two methods. Maybe I can push this cube a bit. Well, it's that one. Where were we? Here. Maximum bounces. 1, 2. Well. Anyway, I think this is a setting that I think the number of bounces does not increase the performance as much. Usually it does not. Well, for the global illumination, it's of course different. It's like on here, 30 to 40 milliseconds difference. So this is of course insane. When I tested this on an RTX card, it was not that much of a difference. But here, just for this darker quality improvement, I would say this is not worth. I would leave it on 1 if you do not have the card to afford it. And the samples per pixel, with a default value of 4, of course, it looks way nicer. You don't see this flickering bright spots, at least not as much. Whereas with a setting of 1, you would see them quite obvious here, especially in the shadows. Like there's these dark blotches happening, and that's horrible. But as I said earlier, I think having some blotches in darker areas is not as bad, because usually your scene will be a bit more noisy in these darker areas anyway, so it's not as obvious, right? So a setting of 2 samples there is most likely fine. Of course, if someone has the latest RTX card, they can go a bit higher. Yeah. In general, about the RayTraced Global Illumination, if we compare it to the SS GI, so I can just quickly turn that on and off. There is a massive difference in quality, especially in these darker areas, yeah. Because the ray-traced one is of course so much more accurate, and also I think we saw this here in the back. I think here it will be quite obvious as well. On this left side, in general, it's just a massive difference. The cost is a lot higher though, I can tell you that. Like, it's a lot higher. We can take a look at that in a second. So the brute force method and the other one again. One other benefit of the global illumination when ray traced is, of course, that you do not have the issue that Screenspace GI has. So Screenspace GI, as soon as something disappears from the screen, would not work properly anymore. So if we take a look at that blue cube, maybe we can simulate this here. As soon as the blue cube leaves my view on the left side, suddenly we have no GI at all anymore, where we had some before. It makes no sense, right? And if we turn back on the brute force method for the ray traced one, we can see there is clearly still the blue tint going on from the cube. So that is, of course, another benefit of the ray traced one, that we do not have this issue. In general, I would probably disable the ray traced global illumination because of how costly it is. I will show you that now. So to bring up the GPU visualizer, that is kind of a profiler, you just hit Ctrl Shift and comma, and then you will get this small nifty window here with a breakdown of all the GPU cost for one frame. Of course, you would, if you would create a proper game, you need to run this in full screen and also in standalone, for example, just to get proper values for your game. For me, this is already a good representation, and I cannot even run with a higher resolution, so that's okay. And the thing that we want to take a look at is this one here, this massive chunk, diffuse, indirect, and ambient occlusion. No idea why they called it like that. But yeah, you will find the RayTracing GI and brute force method right here, and it says 21 milliseconds, which is a lot. If you compare it to all the other things, for example, the ray-traced ambient occlusion only has 10 milliseconds, all the lights together only 12, the ray-traced reflections 11 milliseconds, so this is by far the most expensive one here. And we cannot really get this much cheaper. There is not a lot of settings we can play with, and we cannot go down in quality, so that is the reason why I actually prefer to disable this. We can just take a look at that right now. So I disable the Screenspace GI. I'm going to do another snapshot. It's going to open it in a new tab here, which is quite useful because then we can jump back and forth. And if we take a look at this chunk here now, it's a lot smaller, of course, because we disabled it. And you can see that the Screenspace GI now popped up. The Screenspace GI is instant, it replaces the ray traced one as soon as we disable the ray traced one. And that one only has 2.55 ms on my machine, which is quite okay. I think for the quality that we're getting, the Screenspace global illumination is definitely something to consider. Of course, we could disable that one as well, and then we have neither of the two, which would be another step down, I would say. Yeah, one more thing to global illumination. Of course, this is going to be the next gen feature. That's why Epic with Unreal Engine 5 has basically their new global illumination next gen solution with Lumen. And hopefully we will not have to worry too much about all of these things when Lumen comes out, because it will hopefully run at a better performance, of course. Okay, so that was these two. So let's go to the reflections. Reflections, of course, is the #1 topic. Usually everyone puts water puddles in their scenes and everything looks amazing with ray-traced reflections. I created another cube here with a metal material in which I've just set the roughness to 0 so that you get this pristine sphere, just so that we can see this ray tracing perfectly. Here on the right is the cube with the more noisy, with a rougher metallic surface, and that one just looks a bit more weird in general. Also, as you can see here, there's a weird artifact going on. I think this is due to the fact that it's a translucent material, and maybe it has to do with my settings. Anyway, so the ray-traced reflection settings are here under reflections. I don't know why it's not under ray tracing, where it usually should be. So if I toggle this on and off, you can see a massive difference, of course, right away. The further we go away from this sphere, though, the less noticeable the difference. So here the Screenspace solution also looks quite good, I'd say. Of course, not as accurate, and especially not from every angle, but not bad. So the Screenspace one is actually quite a good solution that Epic has implemented here. So this is always a good fallback if you cannot afford the RayTraced one. But I think the RayTraced reflections look amazing, and they are not the most expensive ones. I've done a few things here to the settings. So the usual is 1 bounce, I think is the default. If we take a look at these spheres, though, if we would put that one over here, and we take a look in the reflection of that sphere over here. Where is my post-processor? Yeah, of course I have to go to ray tracing. So if we now take a look at this sphere and we look at the other sphere, is entirely black. And that is of course because it bounces and then cannot pick up another bounce there. And if we would change the maximum bounces to 2, you will see that it picks up this metalness, and we see the reflection of the other one as well, which is really nice and I think is what we want. It's not too expensive. Here the second bounce, if you take a look at the MS, it's around 57, 58. And if I increase this, it's 59, 60. So this is not a massive difference and definitely worth it. Also in here at the bottom, you can feel that all of these dark black artifacts that we had with 1 bounce will go away with 2. That's quite nice. One thing that you might notice though is that on this sphere here, on the clean one, that if you increase this to 2 bounces, from 1 bounce, you will get these weird artifacts at the top. And I've avoided those by setting the maximum roughness to 0.5. And then those disappear like right away, and it looks great with 2 bounces. This tick box here, include translucent objects. I've ticked this as I thought this would be good for the ray-traced translucent objects. But I think this is creating a bug in the tracer, so we do not want this enabled. And then we cannot see our glass sphere through everything. Okay, that was the ray-traced reflections. They of course look really nice, and is always something to, in my opinion, I would enable it. That's why everyone else does it too, because it's relatively cheap compared to the other ray-traced things, and it looks awesome, especially if you have a lot of water in your scene. Yeah. Let me quickly chime in here, sorry for the interruption. So just to clarify, the reflections are of course quite expensive, and this highly depends on your scene, and of course also on the number of bounces. And Epic has a great talk on ray tracing in general. It's quite old, and it's from when ray tracing originally came out. I really encourage you to watch it. It's a great talk. And there they kind of show how to optimize your scene for ray tracing. So, for example, flat surfaces are where the ray can just bounce off right away. They are cheaper than rougher surfaces. And also at some roughness level, they turn off the ray tracing entirely. So if you have a really rough material, it will be turned off. And that's why they created this post-process material here to show how expensive the ray tracing is on different materials. And they also show you a few commands on how you can make this cheaper, as well as this material quality switch here, ray tracing quality switch replace, which you can use in your materials to optimize your scene for ray tracing. And in general, the performance of the ray tracing follows kind of this order. So this is the performance to visual impact, so shadows, for example, would be relatively cheap to do and also look amazing. Whereas then reflections look awesome, but are quite expensive. And for example, the global illumination is super expensive, and the visual impact is not as high as, for example, from the shadows. I just quickly wanted to show you guys this in case you want to optimize. And there is one more talk here for Archviz, and that actually shows you some console variables you can use, for example, to limit the ray distance. This one here. So if you want to play around with that, you can also do that. I'm going to link to both of these in the description, by the way, and I'll let you continue now. Okay, then the last point in this post-process volume, which would be the RayTraced Translucency. So that one is a bit of a tricky one, because I cannot really show you a comparison, because I did not create a glass material that does not require ray tracing. So glass materials with ray tracing need to be set up in a different way than normal glass materials would be. So if I set this to raster, you can see that this glass here that I created looks a bit more like weird plastic. That's just because it's not really set up for the rastered translucency method. It's only a ray tracing glass that I've set up. And we can take a quick look at this material as well, the one that I've created. Give me a second. Here we are. So usually glass materials are just set. Why the hell? Deselect. Thank you. So here you can see I've set it to translucent, of course, double-sided, because we don't only want one side. In a normal glass material, you can sometimes get away with single-sided, whereas on the ray-traced one, it's quite important that you make it double-sided. And then the next point is to, of course, change the lighting mode so that it can be affected by lighting, either translucent volume or forward shading. I could not really see a difference, so I'm not sure what the difference actually is. And in the then I always untick render after depth of field, because I want the glass to be set in the scene, and if you do not do this, it cannot be affected by any depth of field effects, and it will just stand out, which is the usual method for visual effects, but we don't want this in this case. We want it to be like any other object. And I think that was already it, except for one specialty in the material itself, and that is that the refraction is not linked into this refraction pin. It is linked into the specular pin, because for some reason, for ray-traced glass or ray-traced translucent materials in general, it needs to be connected to the specular pin, the refraction. So how much refraction is going on, like how much light is breaking through, is being broken inside of this translucent surface. And the rest is all pretty much straightforward. Metallic should be set to 1. The roughness is was a bit of a hassle to set up. I can show you that in a second. And then in the opacity, I just made it being affected by a Fresnel, so that on the outside of this, you can see this here on the glass sphere, the outside of this sphere, the opacity should be higher. And that's just because of how the light breaks. I think this simulates this behavior a bit better with the Fresnel effect. And as you can see, I did not pipe the refraction directly into the specular value. I've created this weird stuff here at the bottom where I'm adding something depending on the roughness. And here I've just used a noise because I didn't have a texture in the project, but you can of course use a texture instead of a noise value here. And I can show you in a second what exactly that does. So I've already created a glass window here. Ta-da! So right now we are having the ray-traced glass on, right? And this is how it looks like. It's relatively subtle, I think, because I did not go crazy with the refraction. If I would change the refraction to something a bit more crazy, right now it's 0.0066. If I would go 0.1, you can clearly see that there is a change happening, and especially on this glass sphere here, the distortion will become quite crazy. Like right now, we are looking through it and we cannot see anything because it's so distorted. If I go back to the value I had before, you can see it's a bit more normal. It's kind of bending around the edge here where the glass is refracting it, which looks quite nice, and that is more the behavior that we want. Of course, this is not as obvious on the normal, on a flat glass plane. If you would have a normal map applied to that, it would be a bit more obvious and quite naturally looking, I think. And then the opacity parameter, for example, it of course makes the glass either completely see-through. So this is a completely see-through glass window now. We can still see the refraction going on, but we cannot see any reflections inside of the glass, which is why I've put it to something about 0.4, so that we still get some reflection of the as well in that glass window. So we can see this especially here on the glass sphere, that the sky is reflecting a lot. If we would put this to 0, we can see no reflection at all, and it just looks wrong. Even 0.1 already looks much better. I've just did it 0.4 because I thought it just looked a bit more like a window actually reflecting something. And another thing that you will notice here is that, of course, again, our sphere here in the back is completely black in the reflection for no apparent reason. This is not optimal, but I could not find a good way of fixing this without increasing the bounces to a lot. So this is just something that we will need to live with. One setting, I think, if we go back to our post-process volume, I've changed the settings a tiny bit, so the maximum number of refraction rays I've actually upped to 4. I think the default is 3. I think it makes not a massive difference, but also it's not a massive difference in costs, and sometimes you will see some artifacts going on with only 3 rays. That's why I have upped this. You can see it here in the other glass sphere through this glass window. So if I go on 4, you can see that it just creates a bit of a higher quality. It's not as dark, at least there. Whereas you can see this other sphere that is reflecting in the glass is completely dark again, which probably has something to do with how many rays we have in the reflection settings. Maybe if we up those, we would see that these will go away. So if we go like 4 bounces, no, it won't. So that actually doesn't affect it at all. If we include translucent objects, no. So I'm not sure how we can even fix this, but I think it's just something that you will have to live with, that other objects reflected there with a lot of reflection will not be visible. Well, will be black. They will be visible but black. And now the last thing that I did, which is this complicated part in the material, that is to alter the roughness of the glass. So of course I sometimes want rougher glass. This looks really noisy, and that is of course because of the way the ray tracer works. So if we would up the sample rates of some of these ray tracing settings, we would get smoother results here, but I think that's probably not really worth it. But without this compensation that I'm doing in the material, if I set this to 0, you can see that the roughness of the glass has increased. So all the reflection, this one here, the black sphere, which is a reflection, is being affected by this roughness change, yeah. Whereas the refraction, which is this sphere behind the object, is not being affected by that. And that is super weird. That just gives you a really weird look in general, to have some things being refracted perfectly clear, whereas others are reflected really noisy due to the roughness change. And that's why I created this refraction roughness influence to compensate for that. So this kind of just blurs or noises the refraction part as well, depending on the roughness. Of course, if we would set the roughness to 0, you can see both of it is really quite sharp, and the higher we go with this, the more noisy also the refraction will become. I think this is of course not a perfect method to do this, but it's a good compensation, and depending on which kind of noise you would put in here, you can get different frosted glass effects. This might also be relevant if you pipe in a normal map. Maybe you can also adjust this setting depending on the normal map and so on. But this is a simple example of how to do this. Okay, and all the other settings I've left unchanged in here. I think it actually doesn't increase the quality by all that much. Even if we take a look at a pristine glass, so if I turn down the roughness again, and we have a pristine glass, the difference between 4 and 1 is so neglectable, like I can't really even feel that. 4, 1, no difference. So I think these are all good settings for that. By the way, you can disable the refraction if you don't want it, but I wouldn't know why you would not want a glass with a refraction. Of course you want that. Yeah, and with this you already have the nice windows that everyone in Cyberpunk always complained about, that you cannot see your reflection. This would not be a problem here. You would see, of course, your reflection. If we put a sphere here, we would of course see that sphere inside of the glass material. Yeah, here it is, perfect sphere, perfectly reflected. If we go through the glass, perfectly refracted. So yeah, that's it for the translucency. I think the translucency is also relatively expensive. We can try to make another snapshot here with the translucency enabled. And yeah, we can see it here. It's a massive chunk, 19 milliseconds. Again, of course, on my non-RTX machine, but that's still a big chunk. And I think maybe not worth it. Like, it really is a high-end feature, I would say, and you can't really get it that much cheaper. You could shoot less rays, but if you go on one ray already, you can see it completely breaks. So you cannot really decrease this by a lot. Maybe you could disable the hard shadows, but I think also at some point it just becomes something where it's not worth doing anymore, and it's more about just having a normal glass material and that's it, right? Yeah, so I will disable the translucency ray tracing for now. Also because we are going to build a natural scene with some of the Quixel assets, and we are just going to have a lot of rocks or something in there and not glass. If we will ever build a cyberpunk scene, we can revisit it and see if it's worth having that enabled. So yeah, and that nearly concludes our ray tracing. There's one more thing, and that would be the shadows. I'm just going to leave it as is for now. Close that profiler, and the shadows are not in this post-process volume. They're inside of the lights directly. So if we go into the directional light and type ray tracing, then we can find all the ray tracing settings for this light in here. So RayTraced Shadows are on, the RayTraced reflections of this light. If we disable that, we will of course instantly see the change, that there is no light being reflected anymore from this light source. The shadows are not as obvious. I'm gonna show you that in a second. And then there is the effect RayTrace Global Illumination, which I thought would be amazing. To have the light affect the GI, but if we enable the GI again, brute force GI, and take a look at the directional light and enable this, I'm seeing really weird artifacts here at the bottom of the scene. It's like flickering, and also the entire scene is weirdly brightened. I think this is of course also due to the fact that these cubes are entirely white, and are reflecting a lot of the sunlight then back and forth. But yeah, here these really bright artifacts on the back of this cube, they make no sense to me, and that is why I have it disabled, at least for now. Maybe with actual assets that would be a different thing, but that's why I have this disabled for now, even of course even with the GI enabled here. And I personally disable this GI because it's so expensive and for me not worth it. But yeah, if you have a high-end machine, you would of course use the RayTrace global illumination, and then I think it's better to have this setting off. And then we have the samples per pixel also in the light directly, so we could up this sample rate for exactly this light, and we would get better ray tracing results from just this light. And then let's go to the shadows. So the ray-traced shadows actually look really nice. I think they look superb and they give you a lot of quality. So if we take a look at those shadows, maybe here we can already see a difference. Ray-traced shadows. Yeah, you will instantly see the difference. Here they are a lot sharper. But the other benefit of those is that they are sharp at the beginning, and then they will kind of dissipate the further they are away from the shadow caster. And this dissipation you can also change depending on the light source. So if you type source, if you would change the source angle, you can see that all of these shadows are getting a lot blurrier, basically a lot softer, really nice and soft. Whereas here at the start, of course, they still stay sharp, which is a natural behavior and looks really good. And I think you can also, with the radius of the source, if you would have a point light, you can play around with the source radius, and that one will also make the shadows softer there. That one. You can feel that all of these shadows here, especially there, they get really nice and soft, depending on what kind of results you want to have, of course. One thing to note about the shadows is that if you have ray-traced shadows, which is really a shame, this behavior, if you enable the ray-traced shadows, you will not be able to get volumetric shadows in the fog. So I can try to show you that. So if I go into the exponential height fog and I will increase the density of both this fog and the other one, you can feel that the fog is of course getting a lot thicker if I increase that. But this is just for demonstration purposes now. Maybe we can put a cube in the air, which hopefully throws a shadow then. So if we go volumetric shadow, it needs to be enabled, cast volumetric shadow. And then the ray-traced shadows would need to be disabled. And you can already see a change happening as well in here. It's not really as obvious though. But here you can clearly see, here is the light ray in the fog coming from this direction light. So if I would turn this cube, you can see that this God ray behavior changes. And if I now enable the shadows again, you can see that this is entirely gone. So we cannot really get these God rays, and that's a shame. I can show you one more example where this would be even more obvious. If I put a point light here and I enable these, I disable the ray traced shadows and I enable the volumetric shadow. It's usually not on by default, and I increase this intensity to 200, for example, a crazy high value. Then you can really see this God ray here, right? Like you really feel that how the objects occlude this light in the volume, in the volumetric fog, which is a great effect. Like that looks amazing. And if I disable the ray tracing, if I enable the ray traced shadows we are not getting any of this behavior anymore. I think this is really a shame, and maybe even a bug, I'm not sure. But yeah, so that's kind of, you have to juggle whether or not you want the ray-traced shadows or you want these volumetric shadows. I think if you have a light source that has a lot of volumetric effect in it, basically, then you would probably prefer the ray tracing off. And if you have just a high quality light in a room or something where there's no fog, then you would of course turn the ray traced shadows on to get higher quality shadows there. Okay, let me delete that light. Yeah, and let me quickly think if there's anything else. Maybe performance optimization in general. Of course, there is always the console, and you can always type ray tracing and find all the console commands here to for every one of these: ambient occlusion, the global illumination, reflections, and there is a lot of settings in there, right? Like you can tweak endlessly there, I would say. And of course, it depends on your project. How much is your performance budget? What's your target audience? And so on and so forth. What's your setting? Which kind of ray tracing effects do you need for your setting, and so on. So I'm not really going to go into all of these. Also, it's just a lot of work to do that. And preferably you do that kind of in the middle and end of your project, because then you will have a bit more to go by, and you will know how to optimize and what to optimize. Yeah, so if I disable it, we can take one last look at, let me just enter here, weird, come on. We can take one last look at how it looks with and without the ray tracing on and off. Let me delete the air cube. So yeah, I'm not quite sure if I want to enable the ray traced shadow here or not, because I really like the volumetric effects that I get in the fog, but well, gonna also dial down the fog a tiny bit to the default values just so that we can see what we are actually doing in here. Okay, so let's take one last look at the ray traced on and off, maybe also with the glass, of course, because the glass does look nice. Ray traced glass, here we go. What a perfect reflection in here, or refraction. Okay, ray traced off, ray traced on. I mean, the biggest difference is really sometimes in these shadowy areas here, even though we have the SSGI on, you can still see that these are a lot darker without the ray tracing on. And here the reflections in the glass, of course, and in general the reflections are a massive difference. Yeah. But I think we will be able to get decent results with both of these rendering methods. So even for people who cannot afford the ray tracing, we can probably find some good solutions there. Or maybe turn on only some of the ray tracing features and not all of them at the same time. Not sure why the sky actually changes so much. I think this has to do with the sky dome, most likely. Sky dome, if I... Yeah, I can just actually delete the sky dome. We don't need the sky dome. Yeah, no change in the sky anymore. That's better. There we go. That's it. That was ray tracing number 2 of our tutorial series. And the next step is going to be building a scene with Megascans assets, because I think it's really important to have some proper calibrated photogrammetry assets to go with all of this nice ray tracing settings. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.